You thought the CIA was just an intelligence agency?
Victory over drugs is our cause, a just cause. And with your help, we are going to win.
It's sweet that you're so trusting, because what the evidence actually suggests is that the CIA might just be the world's biggest drug cartel.
I will tell you, Director Deutsch, as a former Los Angeles police narcotics detective, that the agency has dealt drugs throughout this country.
I know this sounds like it's straight out of the fever swamps of a conspiracy buff, but that's only because you probably haven't heard of Barry Seal, Air America, Gary Webb, Operation Just Cause, the other side of the Iran-Contra affair, the Golden Crescent, and many other highly questionable things. I'm talking tons and tons of files, secret memos, investigations that have revealed over and over again how the CIA helped facilitate the global drug trade, including how the CIA was involved in the 1980s crack explosion in US inner cities. Yup, that was the CIA. From secret missions to scandalous alliances, in today's video I'll expose damning evidence after damning evidence that proves that the CIA is just a government-endorsed drug cartel. Don't blink. The CIA's origin story is already sus as hell. The agency, as the cool kids call it, is always claiming to act in the best interests of national security. But then the full story comes to light, and we realize that the CIA has repeatedly sacrificed the safety and well-being of Americans on the altar of the country's bloodthirsty ambitions. In fact, the word blowback was actually invented by the CIA and refers to unintended consequences that typically occur in the course of the CIA carrying out its questionable missions. One of those blowbacks is the global drug trade that the CIA has both actively and passively sponsored. But believe me when I tell you that even after the extensive information I'm going to reveal in this video, you still won't know the half of it by the time we're done. So if you want a separate video on epic CIA blowbacks, just drop a comment, because uncovering that alone is going to take a whole day. Alright, back to this video. As I mentioned earlier, the CIA's history is sus as hell. The agency was born in 1947 during the Cold War, but even this birth wasn't exactly a fresh birth. It was more like a respawn of an old devil called the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, and that, kids, is where our story begins. Ever heard of Wild Bill Donovan? Sure, the nickname hardly feels fitting because he looks like your average run-of-the-mill grandpa, but in his heyday, this dude was a real rule-breaking, thrill-loving, courageous military man who played by his own rules and founded the OSS. Sometime around 1941, while World War II was still raging, Donovan reached out to President Roosevelt with the idea to set up an intelligence agency. Roosevelt quickly agreed because, well, he needed information about the other side, aka the Soviets, desperately. And even though at the time all the different branches of the military had their own intelligence operations, they didn't coordinate with one another, and Roosevelt considered them useless in essence. So when Donovan reached out, FDR immediately set up an office called the Coordinator of Information and made Donovan director. It was this office that later became the Office of Strategic Studies in 1942, after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and FDR felt like America needed to scale up her intelligence some more. Now, just like with the COI, the mission of the OSS was to gather intelligence, and as a 1998 report from the House of Reps reveals, their first order of business would be to form an alliance with our friendly neighborhood drug lords in the Italian Mafia. From New York to Chicago, the OSS recruited all kinds of colorful underworld characters in a bid to establish a connection with the Sicilian Mafia leaders. What the OSS was hoping was that the Sicilian Mafia would give them intel on communist operations and eventually help them drive out the Italian Communist Party that had started gaining popularity in Italy at the time. Of course, it was this relationship that later set the stage for the CIA to step in and help the Mafia seize power in Sicily shortly after its birth in 1947. The CIA appointed Mafia leaders to key positions in the Allied military government, knowing fully well they were involved in the drug trade, and, of course, the cover story was that America just wanted to drive communism out of Italy. Yeah, right. And it wasn't even just the Italian Mafia. There were others, like the Chinese gangsters who were responsible for a vast sector of the opium, morphine, and heroin industry. They would also go on to form the Golden Triangle, but more on that in a bit. Then there were the Corsican mobsters in Marseille who were funded by the CIA to keep France from falling to communism. Of course, never mind that the Corsican mobsters would later help to form the French Connection, which would end up dominating the global heroin trade until the early 1970s. All this before the CIA even officially turned 2 years old, mind you. So imagine how much more dirt we're about to dig up in this video. And opium trade in the Golden Triangle became disgustingly entangled. Routes that CIA command teams were using to infiltrate China became drug smuggling routes. These same locales who helped to guide the CIA agents at the Burma-Chinese border also helped guide opium caravans into China. Not only that, the 5 secret CIA training grounds in the Golden Triangle were protected by drug smuggling KMT troops. The CIA was now fully intertwined in the drug business. By the time the 1960s and 1970s came around, the CIA had expanded its drug operations into Laos and Cambodia. Langley literally helped a known drug kingpin, Vang Pao, to purchase Air America aircraft so he could use it to move opium paste and heroin back and forth from Long Thieng Air Base to Vietnam. And a good chunk of those drugs would fall into the hands of American soldiers themselves. Our boys were not just risking their lives in a foreign war, thanks to the CIA's dirty business, they were destroying their bodies too. Soldiers were ingesting everything from weed to heroin just to be able to cope with the atrocities they were witnessing at the war front. But even this was not enough to get the CIA to backpedal even a little bit. Once again, they expanded the frontiers and took their drug trade disguised under the convenient mask of fighting the Soviets to Afghanistan. But more on that later. In the meantime, let's talk about Air America. No, not the movie, the real life Air America. You don't really know this airline, do you? I mean, you know Virgin Atlantic, Delta Airlines, American Airlines, but what is Air America? Definitely not your usual jet-setting company, no. This was a top-secret delivery service that could get into places even the US military couldn't get into. Now, at first, Air America was put to good use. With over 80 aircraft in its fleet, the airline proved very helpful during the Vietnam War, moving troops and refugees, supplying relief materials, and even helping in search and rescue missions. But, of course, this was far from the full story. While Air America was doing all these heroic deeds on the outside, behind the scenes, certain people, well known to the CIA, were using the airline to smuggle heroin out of northern Laos. Once again, the story's the same. The benevolent CIA was only trying to help a poor group of rebels fighting to save their country from a dictatorial leader. It just happened to be a coincidence that said rebel group was also made of prominent drug lords. But at the risk of pointing out the obvious, why does the CIA keep getting entangled with such groups? Well, I'll tell you why. Langley keeps finding itself in such entanglements because it's profitable for them. At least that's the most logical deduction to make considering everything we've seen and everything we're yet to see. Oh, yes, there is more. Actually, you're already a bit familiar with this one I'm about to talk about, the Iran-Contra affair. I've kind of covered this a bit in another video where I talked about devious secret missions the US military's carried out, some of which almost cost US citizens their lives. You can check that one out here. In the meantime, though, there are two things I didn't cover in that video, and they confirm something we all knew all along, because even though the CIA keeps lying to us like we don't, we actually do have working brains. To begin with, for the longest time, when rumors started spreading that the CIA was involved in drug smuggling, the agency acted like it didn't even know what the word meant. Well, in 1998, the report of an investigation carried out by Frederick Hitz, one-time Inspector General of the CIA, became declassified, and the revelation was not even shocking at all. Turns out, throughout the Iran-Contra affair, the CIA was well aware of the Contras' drug trafficking enterprise. In spite of that, the CIA continued to work with the Contras and even outrightly employ them to help them take down the Sandinistas who had gotten all chummy with the Soviets. A very good example was Alan Hyde. Hyde was a Honduran businessman, if you know what I mean. This dude made a fortune from dealing coke, and yet the CIA used him to ship guns by sea from 1987 to 1988. And what about the pilots? Carlos Amador, for example, was accused of smuggling cocaine from San Salvador to South Florida. The DEA tried to investigate the accusations, but for some reason the CIA just wouldn't allow it, insisting that only legitimate operations were conducted from Hangar 4. Why the games? Sure, Hitz makes it clear in his report that the CIA didn't directly smuggle drugs, but some of the pilots who flew for the CIA remembered the story a little differently.
Do you really believe the government decided to get into the drug business in order to pay for the Contras?
As incredulous as it may sound, I believe that they not only decided to get into it, I think they orchestrated the whole thing.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. As a benefit of helping the CIA run some supplies, Tolliver says they allowed him to freelance on the way back from his supply run. In fact, they did more than just allow.
And that as an extra added bonus, we could either freelance on the way back.
Meaning what?
Well, I mean, we could bring back our own cargo, and they would arrange it, or we could bring back their cargo without ever having to worry about interception, arrest, anything like this, that everything was taken care of.
What kind of cargo were you talking about?
Drugs.
What kind of drugs?
Whatever you wanted, marijuana, cocaine.
Whatever you want to come back with, fine, we can make sure you don't get hit by customs.
It was my understanding that they would make sure we wouldn't get caught. They would provide not only the cargo, but the landing areas, crews, everything.
For drug runs?
Yeah.
They would also provide the drugs if you wanted.
Absolutely, which indeed they did.
Not directly involved in drug smuggling, my foot. But oh boy, things are only just starting to heat up. The Iran-Contra affair hardly ends there. I told you didn't know the full story.
The drug so powerful it will empty the money from your pockets, make you sell the watch off your wrist, the clothes off your back.
Or kill your mother. Yep, that's what we're saying.
On the streets of New York, it's called crack, and the deals go down quickly. You've just witnessed a buy. This form of cocaine comes concentrated. It is smoked rather than sniffed. It produces an intense high within 5 to 10 seconds that lasts only 5 to 10 minutes and leaves the user craving for more.
Did you know that the crack epidemic that ravaged Los Angeles in the 80s can be traced back to the CIA-Contra drug alliance? No, I'm not kidding you. If you've been around a bit, you probably remembered this guy, Gary Webb. He's passed now. Everyone says it was suicide, even though Webb was found with 2 gunshots to his head. I mean, I could have sworn there was no way someone could off themselves by shooting themselves in the head twice, but okay. Anyways, so August 1996, around the time Osama bin Laden declared war on the United States, Webb published this set of devastating articles that he'd spent over a year preparing. According to the articles, a dark, ugly, and complicated web had somehow formed between CIA operations, the Contra rebels, and the crack epidemic growing in the inner cities of the US. While the CIA turned a blind eye, or probably even assisted in some way, Danilo Blandin and Norwin Meneses channeled cocaine from CIA-backed Contra rebels straight into the waiting hands of black gangs in Los Angeles through their frontman, Ricky Ross. Yes, that's where your fave got his name from. Ricky Ross would then turn the coke into crack and sell it to inner cities nationwide, using his connection with the LA gangs, Crips, and Bloods.
Cooking was always our most vulnerable and our most time-consuming thing to do. Usually you could put it in like a big Samsonite suitcase. You could put 100 keys just about in one of those, or maybe 2 of them. So that's what we normally cooked every night, like 100 kilos. Well, the way we did it is I basically was a chef. You know, I did all the stirring. I would tell the guys to mix. Like one guy, he would be standing there, and I would tell him, add more baking soda, pour more water, you know, that type of situation. So it was more, it was like an assembly line.
Meanwhile, the CIA continued to funnel cash into the hands of these Contra rebels who, in turn, were supplying Ross with cheap, pure cocaine. The gangs, on the other hand, would use the money they made from their drug trade to buy weapons oftentimes from the very same drug dealers that had been linked to the CIA. Like I said, it was a nasty, complicated web, and Webb swore that all of this was real and not fiction.
How reliable were your sources for this piece?
Well, the central source for it is now a DEA informant. I mean, he testified to a lot of this stuff under oath on the witness stand down in San Diego in March. And last Friday, the U.S. government stood up in court and said the man's believable. They believe everything he says.
This whole dirty business is crucial to understanding some of America's social issues today, especially the mass incarceration of black men and the current prison industrial complex that exists. But we don't have time to get into all of that today. Let me know if you'd want me to talk about that in a separate video. In the meantime, many rose up and tried to debunk Webb's claims, from the CIA IG at the time, John Deutsch, to major media outlets like the Washington Post and the New York Times, but the evidence was too damning to ignore. For instance, CIA-supplied planes were allegedly moving cocaine from Central America into the US. One DEA agent, Celerino Castillo, even raised an alarm that cocaine was being stashed at a CIA warehouse in El Salvador.
During the Bush era, I actually met President Bush Sr., and I told him about the Contras being involved in drug trafficking, and he just shook my hand and smiled and walked away.
Shortly after that goody two-shoes move, he was retaliated against. Speaking of planes, this video would hardly be complete if we weren't to talk about Barry Seal. Barry Seal was a pilot with the US Army's Special Forces, and if you didn't already know, he's the guy that Tom Cruise plays in American Made, which, by the way, has an 85% on Rotten Tomatoes, so do with that information what you will. Anyway, like most pilots, Seal loved the fast life. Oddly enough, though, he wasn't into smoking, drinking, or doing drugs. However, there's no telling the story of the CIA's global drug trade without mentioning the name Barry Seal. Back in the mid-70s, Seal was well known in the underworld, boasting an impressive fleet of planes and a network of pilots and mechanics who helped him move arms into the black market in Latin America. Before long, Seal became acquainted with the Medellin drug cartel and started to help smuggle coke into southeastern US. Needless to say, Seal was banking huge, recording daily deposits of up to $50,000. Yeah, every single day. By 1982, Seal decided to move his operational base to Mena, Arkansas, and it was here that he reconnected with the CIA. The two had their first casual fling back in '72, but it was nothing serious. This time, the CIA was ready to take things to the next level. Don't forget that this was around the time when Langley was secretly backing the Contra rebels, so they came up with the idea that maybe they could use SEAL's planes to ship arms to the Contras covertly. These guys, Alexander Cockburn and Jeffrey St. Clair, did some solid investigative reporting on this in their book, Whiteout, and what they found out was insane. Pay attention. Apparently, the CIA felt that SEAL's drug smuggling trade would provide the perfect disguise. Since SEAL was a known drug dealer, no one would ever suspect that the planes were carrying arms for the Contras, and of course, SEAL was not about to turn down a perfectly good opportunity to make money, so he agreed. After all, implicit in that agreement was the guarantee that the CIA would protect him and his fleet from getting hassled by either Customs or the DEA, and that was precisely what happened. Shortly after beginning to run errands for the CIA, the Customs Service was going to do a drug investigation into one of SEAL's pilots, but then they got a note from one of the higher-ups, which pretty much let them know that the guy they wanted to look into works for SEAL, and SEAL was untouchable. Meanwhile, a couple of guys had started to suspect the volume of activity going on at Mena. Bill Duncan, an IRS investigator, and Russell Welch, an Arkansas State Police investigator. Duncan in particular received numerous reports about suspicious activity around the area, and so he and Welch decided to look into a possible connection between Mena and SEAL, suspecting that there was probably a drug smuggling and money laundering business going down. In response, the powers that be pretty much destroyed their careers. Because the truth was that Mena served as a base of operations for the CIA, where they trained Contra pilots and troops to fight against the Sandinistas. Coincidentally, Mena also happened to be Barry SEAL's operational base. It was where SEAL had his planes refitted for drug drops, where he trained his own pilots, and where he laundered his profits, sometimes through some banks in Arkansas, which leads us to the Clinton connection.
A young rising politician named Bill Clinton, age 32, the state's one-term attorney general, won the Democratic nomination for Arkansas governor.
It was here at Rich Mountain Aviation that authorities believed Barry SEAL moved his operation.
Now, here's one thing you won't see in the Hollywood/Tom Cruise version of events. Around the time when Mena was still a hotspot for the CIA's covert Contra drug smuggling business, Bill Clinton was governor of Arkansas. So naturally, when he decided to run for president, many had questions for him about Mena. Clinton claimed that Mena was federal jurisdiction, which is correct.
The airport in question and all the events in question were the subject of state and federal inquiries. It was primarily a matter for federal jurisdiction. The state really had next to nothing to do with it.
But as you're about to see, it was also a load of bull. Charles Black was one of the state prosecutors in Arkansas at the time, and according to him, he personally brought the issue to Clinton's attention in 1988.
His response to me was that he would get a man, something to the effect that he would get a man on it and would get word back to me, and I never heard back.
In fact, 5 years before then,
For nearly 2 years, the United States, nations of Latin America and the Caribbean have worked together to resolve the crisis in Panama.
let's begin with the so-called Operation Just Cause, which, of course, was anything but just from start to finish. So, sometime around December 1989, the US decided to invade Panama with an aim to depose the then strongman at the time, Miguel Noriega, aka Mr. Pineapple Face. It's a cruel nickname, but you've got to admit, it's fitting. Anyway, Operation Just Cause turned out to be short, but very effective. By January 1990, Noriega had surrendered and a new pro-American government was put in his place.
At about 8:50 this evening, General Noriega turned himself in to U.S. authorities in Panama with the full knowledge of the Panamanian government.
The Bush-led government claimed that Noriega needed to be ousted because of his racketeering and drug trafficking. The actual truth, however, was not that straightforward. Before Bush became president, he had once served as CIA director and then vice president. In other words, he was well aware of all of Noriega's shady dealings. In fact, he and Noriega were besties at some point, with Pineapple Face playing a key role in countering Cuban and Soviet influence in Central America. Noriega also served as a middleman between America and Contra rebels, plus he had strong ties with the Medellin drug cartel, and what Bush didn't know, however, was that at some point in their relationship, Noriega had started to play him. By manipulating influence, Pineapple Face steadily consolidated power in Panama, forming what's come to be known today as narco-kleptocracy. Slowly, Noriega gained enough power to begin to defy the American government outright. But his refusal to help Oliver North's arm deal with the Contra rebels turned out to be the last straw. Bush knew then and there that Noriega had to be taken out. Noriega knew way too much about America's secret operations, and if he was ready decided to turn his back on North right in the middle of an arms deal with the Contras, there was no telling what he would do next. Besides, with the whole Republican war on drugs, how was it going to look if word leaked out that Bush and the Panamanian drug lord were besties? So 2 years after Noriega was deposed, he was taken to trial in Miami, where he was quickly sentenced to 40 years in a maximum security prison. Any hint of his ties with the CIA or his involvement with America's covert operations were effectively wiped clean, giving Bush his revenge while keeping America's shameful actions in Central America under wraps. This precedent of seemingly justified forceful regime change would eventually become a pattern for the United States, effectively setting the stage for the disaster America brought to Afghanistan.
Amidst an economic collapse in Afghanistan, the country's drug trade seems to be booming. It's long been linked with the production of heroin.
Afghans are thronging to Kabul's airport, desperate to get on planes and leave the country at any cost.
Afghanistan was one country where the CIA did some of its best work in destroying an entire country's economy in the name of promoting democratic ideals. For context, over the course of 16 whole years, America sank over $8 trillion in military efforts in Afghanistan, sent more than 100,000 troops down there, lost close to 2,300 soldiers, and spent another $100 billion on so-called nation building. Yet today, after all is said and done, Afghanistan is back in the hands of the Taliban like nothing happened. According to prize-winning historian Alfred McCoy, who discusses this in detail in his book In the Shadows of the American Century, a huge reason behind that is poppy. Let me explain. So, prior to 1979, the Soviets had been flirting with Afghanistan for a bit, and the US obviously wasn't comfortable with that. To be fair, many Afghans weren't comfortable with the idea as well, which led them to form a rebel force to fight the Soviets. On July 3rd, 1979, President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to be sent to opposing forces, called the Mujahideen. Unfortunately for Afghans, it was this singular move that made the Soviets invade Kabul in December of 1979. So yes, whether they meant to or not, America caused the Kabul invasion and the 10-year war that followed. Now, here's the thing. Before the US butted into Afghanistan's business, Afghanistan was producing heroin, but it was really just a small, insignificant player in the grand scheme of things.
Let's go back to the beginnings of this war in the 1980s. At that point, Afghanistan produces poppy crops, but they are predominantly internal consumption. They don't produce enough to export.
Fast forward to 1981, however, and the story had completely changed. Afghanistan had started to compete in the global heroin market. What changed? The CIA. When the US first landed in Afghanistan to support the Islamic resistance and drive out the Soviets, they decided they weren't going to form their own coalition of resistance leaders. Instead, they were going to work with Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, ISI, and their Afghan clients. These Afghan clients, it turns out, would become key players in the devastating cross-border opium traffic, and the CIA would look the other way while all of that was happening. From 100 tons of opium per year in the 70s prior to the CIA's arrival, Afghanistan's production rate soared to 2,000 tons annually in 1999, around the time when the Afghan war ended. And perhaps it was just a coincidence that it was the same period when the CIA started ramping up its activities in Afghanistan that more heroin laboratories started popping up everywhere along the Afghan-Pakistani border. As a matter of fact, that region would grow to become the world's largest heroin producer, supplying 60% and 80% of the American and European heroin markets respectively. But of course, the drug trade didn't just bring in profits, it also brought devastation. Look, drugs might be evil, but in a war-torn country with the kind of climate Afghanistan has, it's a necessary evil. As the war between the CIA and the Soviets heated up, the CIA-backed Mujahideen had to turn to growing poppy to feed the increasingly impoverished population under their care. Caravans of arms would enter into Afghanistan loaded with arms for the resistance forces. Then they would return to Pakistan loaded with opium. And both the ISI and the CIA were fully aware that this was happening, but they chose not to do anything about it since their agenda of getting the Soviets out of Afghanistan was unaffected by the drug trade. By 1989, the Soviets had been driven out successfully by the CIA and the Mujahideen. But of course, this didn't come without a cost. About 10% of Afghanistan's population, or 1.5 million people, perished from the conflict, and the country desperately needed a breather. But a breather was not to be had because the Mujahideen, though they fought together for a common cause, weren't exactly the best of friends. There were multiple factions within the group, and once Washington backed off to attend to other hotspots in Africa and the Persian Gulf, these guys, who were now sophisticatedly armed thanks to the CIA, began to jostle for power. And somehow, that battle devolved into a fight for control over Afghanistan's opium industry. Now, in the middle of all the bickering, the Pakistani government decided to throw its weight behind one of the Mujahideen factions, which happened to be the Taliban. And when the Taliban finally seized power in 1996, in just 3 short years, they managed to take Afghanistan from a mere large-scale player to the largest player in the global heroin trade. Thanks to the Taliban, Afghanistan now supplied 75% of the world's heroin demand. Fast forward to after 9/11. By this time, the Taliban had placed a ban on the production of opium. Afghans were hungry, poverty was high, and the Taliban knew that this was the only way to curry favor with the international community. Unfortunately for them, banning opium also caused them to begin to lose their grip on the country, paving the way for the Northern Alliance to rise up and overthrow the Taliban. As you'd expect, the US government backed the Northern Alliance, who had helped with the fight against the Soviets back in the 80s, but they also supported a local group of warlords on the Afghan-Pakistani border who, at the time, were active drug smugglers. Of course, this questionable move led to a resurgence of heroin trafficking in Afghanistan. In fact, in an ironic twist of events, profits from this growing heroin trade would end up in the hands of Taliban guerrillas, paving the way for them to make a comeback later in 2001. This time around, the Taliban didn't do any of that righteous opium banning nonsense. They knew that this was the Afghan way now. So, under their rule, Afghanistan scaled up its opium industry and started supplying 93% of the world's illicit heroin demand by 2007. Of course, a significant percentage of the money made from this trade went into the hands of the Taliban, who used the money to get arms and fund their militia. But even at that, make no mistake about it, the industry was majorly being powered by American allies.
However, the major players, the drug lords, the people who have controlled the Afghan drug trade for these last 20 years are the US allies.
Now, through all of this, did the CIA try to suppress the problem? Yes, it did. As a matter of fact, in 2015, the US spent a staggering $8.4 billion on drug eradication programs. Yet, for a long time, Afghanistan continued to boast 500,000 acres of opium poppy fields. For perspective, that's more than 400,000 US football fields, including the end zones. Afghan government officials were literally getting directly involved in the opium trade, and the fight against the Taliban slowly devolved into a struggle for control of the drug traffic. Fortunately, the Taliban announced a ban on poppy cultivation, production, processing, and trade in 2022, and the results were drastic. There was an 85% reduction in the total amount of land dedicated to growing poppy. But once again, it's not all good news alone, because with the decline in opium trade, poverty in Afghanistan is worsening very tragically, and to be honest, at this point, it doesn't seem likely that opium will ever be disentangled from Afghanistan's rural economy.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The committee, House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, is here today to review the report of the CIA Inspector General regarding allegations made in a 1996 newspaper series that the CIA was involved in the trafficking of crack cocaine to California during the 1980s.
I'm guessing you're wondering why the CIA hasn't been brought to book with all of this evidence lying around in plain sight, clear as day. Well, the truth is, it's not like there haven't been efforts to investigate the CIA since all this began. In fact, since 1985, efforts have been made to look into all the allegations against the CIA, but none of them have made any headway. Shocker! In 1985, the Associated Press released a report that linked the Contras with drug traffickers. The bombshell article caused Congress to request a major investigation into the CIA, but what happened next? Nothing. Shortly after that, Senators John Kerry and Christopher Dodd decided that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee should probably hold hearings to look into this so-called Contra drug trade. Of course, the revelations from the Kerry Committee report were every bit as damning as you'd expect them to be.
And what is true is the policymakers absolutely closed their eyes to the criminal behavior of our allies and supporters in that war.
The report, released in 1989, found that part of the Contra drug links were payments made to drug traffickers by the US government to help carry humanitarian aid to the Contras. Altogether, more than $800,000 was paid to known drug traffickers, in some cases after the traffickers had been indicted, and in other cases while the traffickers were under investigation. Unfortunately, even after the story broke, no media outlet would bite. Most networks ignored the story altogether, and the few newspapers that picked it up buried the report in their back pages. It wasn't until 7 years later, when Gary Webb dropped his bombshell of a series titled Dark Alliance, that news of the CIA's dirty business went viral, and the public responded with outrage, which led to 3 other investigations. One by the CIA Inspector General at the time, Frederick Hitz, one by the Justice Department Inspector General, Michael Bromwich, and another investigation by the House Intelligence Committee. Intriguingly, following all these investigations, no form of accountability whatsoever was demanded from the CIA, not to talk of reform. Despite overwhelming evidence of the CIA getting in bed with questionable groups, funding these groups, and even directly participating in the illegal activities of these groups, the conclusion from these investigations was pretty much that the CIA did not do anything wrong. Sure, there have been calls and moves for reform in the CIA, but none of these reforms have had anything to do with the CIA's very obvious involvement with drug cartels. The US government wouldn't even admit that any such thing happened, and of course you can't reform if you won't even admit that there's a problem in the first place. Meanwhile, as the CIA continues to insist on playing dumb, even with the overwhelming amount of evidence against them, Afghanistan has yet to pick up the pieces of its economy. Central America's destiny has perhaps been permanently altered, and minorities continue to suffer indiscriminate incarceration rates here in the US. Who is going to answer for all of that? No one, it seems. In coming videos, I'll explore the CIA's role in the drugging of Black American communities and the indiscriminate mass incarceration rates experienced by Black men and other minority groups. And if you'd like to go down the convoluted rabbit hole of the CIA and uncover its deeply troubling secret missions, then check out this video next. Oh, and by the way, I started including source information for all videos. I do a ton of research before we go live, and I figured some of you might want to check my sources. Moving forward, you can find that information in the description box below the video.